Nani Palkhivala undoubtedly was a legendary lawyer, and it is befitting that any faculty of law must have an avenue which is named after him. You would have read many eulogies about Nani Palkhivala, but there is another way by which you can know about Nani Palkhivala, that is to hear about him from those who came into touch with him directly. I have to my advantage the benefit of the eulogies, but I also have to my advantage my personal recollections of meeting the late Mr. Nani Palkhivala. I would prefer to rely upon the latter and share with you in the very opening 3 remarkable qualities which stood him out in the world of law and actually made him the stuff that legends are. First was his exemplary humility. I'm reminded of the words of Tagore, "We come nearest to the great when we are great in humility." Second, a deeply committed and passionate lawyer to the ideals of the Constitution. And third, a ceaseless advocate who was informed by the spirit within him. We must begin today with some important philosophical assumptions, and they are necessary in the light of what the Vice-Chancellor has remarked as the setting for a debate on constitutional morality. As all of you are aware, that there has always been a debate that where does this expression, morality, come from? Is it connected with conscience? And what is therefore conscience? As far as conscience is concerned, we have had a very elaborate exposition of conscience by Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologiae. And above all, we must bear in mind that according to Thomas Aquinas, conscience is something which binds man to a sense of what is right, distinguishing it from what is wrong. Now, this is one view. At the same time, we must bear in mind that David Hume formed an opinion that the foundations of morals may be based on sentiment and not necessarily reason. But we are taken back to Descartes, who said, "Io pe don je suis, I think, therefore I am." This also takes us to the field of existential moral psychology, which has always concentrated in human freedom, of which we have had great exponents in Simon de Beauvoir, Camus, and all of them saying that this is something special, which is not in the usual conceptual repertoire of human thought. I want to bring to your notice that I was very pleasantly surprised at social liberalism, which also will have some bearing on our discussion today, of T.H. Green, and of course, the later analytical philosophy, which was set out by Bertrand Russell. But one of the greatest philosophers of today, who is no longer with us, is a tremendous British philosopher, Derek Anthony Parfit. He wrote a wonderful book called Reasons and Persons, and he developed the concept of ethics being impersonal. According to him, rationality and time necessarily was important, and he believed that there were no future facts, and all that man could really remember was his best fact and best memory. These are some of, shall we say, the philosophical foundations of morality, which are born out of existentialism, but resonate in some sense with the soul. The question is, if this is the meaning of morality, is it a subjective meaning, or is it a meaning which can be objectified? I am going to urge for your consideration that, based on jurisprudence and political theory, there can be no manner of doubt that constitutional morality is an objective standard. The Vice-Chancellor spoke about the spirit of the Constitution. How do you protect the spirit of the Constitution? Because there could be adherence to the letter of the Constitution. His concern is entirely justified. Therefore, to start with, I would urge you to consider that Nani Palkhiwala made one of the most outstanding contributions in the evolution of Indian constitutional law in Keshavananda Bharati, where the Supreme Court held that the basic structure of the Constitution could not be emasculated. I'm a firm believer that effect of recent developments is that this idea, which has always lived just below the surface of the Indian Constitution, in the way Dr. Ambedkar conceived of it, has finally begun to flower. In a host of debates about the Constitution's meaning, ranging from federalism to religious freedom, the idea of constitutional morality has become the device by which hard constitutional questions can be answered without giving up the discipline that legal reasoning imposes on us. I hope to show to you the power of constitutional morality as an idea for constitutional adjudication in the courtroom, and more importantly, for engaged and enlightened Indian citizens in the everyday life of democracy, in uncovering the meaning of the document and in ensuring that each successive generation of Indians always have the dynamic and living Constitution. The unavoidable limits of language is obviously the legal language. First, the origin of the spirit of constitutionalism lies in human nature and social contract. The first act of a parliament, and we talk about the Indian Parliament, was only a few months after the Constituent Assembly had decided to adopt the Constitution. This was by way of the First Amendment to the Constitution. But the First Amendment tells us about the exigencies of managing power as the state. Did the state want more power? And this is relevant in the light of what the Vice-Chancellor said. Because if power is the fundamental praxis of governance rather than principles, and if principles come first and power second, then the situation is different. But if power comes first and then the determination of principles, the question of the spirit of the Constitution becomes vital. Two decisions triggered the First Amendment Act of 1951. The decision of the Supreme Court in Ramesh Thapar's case, 1951 Supreme Court Reports 594, struck down the Madras Maintenance of Public Order Act 1949. And there was also another judgment called Brijbhushan versus State of Delhi, which struck down the East Punjab Public Safety Act. And this prompted Parliament to amend the Constitution and introduce in Article 19(2) new grounds of public order, relations with foreign states, and incitement of offense for the state to restrict free speech. Leaning on the crutch that the freedom of speech was being abused, the government moved an amendment to add further restrictions to a right whose language had already been debated and carefully considered in the Constituent Assembly before being settled on. Parliament did so with the full awareness of the dangers that arrogating to itself such a sweeping justification to restrict a right without which no democracy worthy of the name could survive. In debating this amendment to add the language of public order, the late J.B. Kripalani made an emphatic appeal against its inclusion by warning of the possibilities of the abuse of such a sweeping and open-ended ground by the government. I quote his words, "If a procession is taken out, public order is disturbed. If some students want some facilities in their schools and colleges, public order is disturbed. If there is a hunger march and people want food, public order is disturbed. When public order is thus disturbed, what do the government do? They have ample powers. They use the police. Our police are very good at shooting. They shoot to kill. It does not matter whether it is women or children that they shoot. There is therefore ample power with the government to shoot even peaceful hunger strikers. What more is needed? I do not understand." The amendment was passed, and public order has since its inclusion to present afforded successive governments the cover under which to suppress actions contrary to its comfort without really needing to discharge its duty to justify its actions fully. Arguably, This was a mutilation and an undermining of a right which under Article 19.2 was already capable of being restricted to protect enumerated national security interests. The constitutional morality of Parliament's first act was of questionable constitutional morality. But the acts of channeling power, which was the work of the Constituent Assembly, and of welding it as the Parliament in whom was a repository of legislative power, are very different creatures. Is not a constitution born of idealism? Is it not meant to guarantee optimism? Is it not meant to ensure a successful destiny in our lives? In the rousing stories of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and indeed in our own moral and extraordinarily principled struggle for Swaraj and self-determination, that narrative is undeniably true. Equally, framers of constitutions across time and place have shown us that constitution making is an exercise in hard-nosed realism. Wisdom over the ages about the Constitution proceeds on a universal truth about human nature, that all men are fallible and that power, however defined, can corrupt. Constitutions are fundamentally instruments by which power is allocated at two levels. It is delegated by the people to their government and its functionaries, and in a quasi-federal system such as ours, it is divided between the center and the states. A corollary of the truism about man's fallible nature is that when any man or group of men is entrusted with a large well of power, we must do all we can through checks and balances. This brings us to the question that Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, all put together in their trinity of thought with reference to human nature, understood that in order to have a limitation on governmental power, one needed a set of principles which would be embodied in a constitution, which also found their foundation in the social contract theory. Hobbes, in his Leviathan, spoke about, and I quote those words, "So that in the first place I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death." And then he says, "And the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he at present without the acquisition of more." In other words, power itself has a psychological tendency for self-propagation. It has the attribute of self-accentuation. Therefore, one needs the Constitution as an important check. But how does it check, shall we say, the accretions of power? It does so through the prism of what we call as constitutional morality. I would say that Locke, in his two treatises of government, also set out virtually the same theory. And here he spoke about the plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war. And then he said that mankind, notwithstanding all the privileges of the state of nature, being put in an ill condition while they remain in it, are quickly driven into society. And further, he said that in this we have the original right and rise of both the legislative and executive power, as well as of the governments and societies themselves. Therefore, we must appreciate that constitutionalism is really a facet of constitutional morality. And what is important is that this is a fundamental value. It is not only a creed of faith, but it is the very basis of any journey in judging or in assessing governmental action in the legislative or the executive sphere. Rousseau said, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they." Rousseau then saw the imposition of a social contract, a constitution which was capable of bringing about a moral transformation. The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and giving his actions the morality they had formerly lacked. On 26 November 1949, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, 2 months before the Constitution came into force, said, "After all, a constitution, like a machine, is a lifeless thing. It acquires life because of the men who control it and operate it. And India today needs nothing more than a set of honest men who will have the interest of the country before them." Dr. Ambedkar was not far behind. He said, "I feel however good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work it happen to be a good lot. The working of a constitution does not depend wholly upon the nature of the constitution. The constitution can provide only the organs of state, such as the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The factors on which the working of those organs of the state depend are the people and the political parties they will set up as their instruments to carry out their wishes and their politics." Hart, in his concept of law, stated the classic version of the problem. Hart said that law is open texture. He borrowed from his colleague, Frederick Weismann, who used the phrase to explain that language can never perfectly represent meaning or reality. Words are imprecise carriers of meaning. I would like to go further, that judges and lawyers live with the problem of legal indeterminacy. We are daily forced to choose between two alternatives, both of which sometimes can be equally logical. How then do we choose? Can judges turn to policy considerations or choose what they like best ideologically? Can they simply decide based on personal preferences, their religion, their personal moralities? The answer is no. And I will come to that a little later, that constitutional morality is really a process of transcendence. It is a process of impersonality. It is a process by which the judgment is outside one's personal preferences and one's narrow vision. Interpretivists accept this more believable picture of the law. They point us to a resource outside the law's text to find its meaning. Dworkin, for instance, argues that looking to the background affords a necessary and sufficient resource to support legal decisions in cases where the foreground is either disputed or indeterminate. The perfect judge is called by Dworkin as Hercules, and he adopts this approach when confronted with legal indeterminacy. Dworkin explains that constitutional argumentation and decision-making must proceed in the hands of a good faith and erudite judge, abreast of the laws and committed to acting with discipline and the commitment to give reasons grounded in the law and not his personal preferences to arrive at a reading of contested words. The law we like to tell ourselves is reasoned, disciplined, rational. We tell ourselves that the law is different from social and public morality. We are bound by a rule of law, not by a rule of the morals or majority. Legal positivism argues that the boundary between law and morality is a strict one. In other words, the questions of what the law is and of what it ought to be are completely separable. Judges should therefore employ their own moral judgments to determine what the law is. When Dworkin spoke of the judge as a Hercules, he is candid in admitting the limits of law and language and in the truth of the work that judges and lawyers do. Legal interpretation, although constrained by legal materials, always requires some moral judgment because these legal materials are inconclusive. This reality is doubly true for constitutions. Their whole purpose is to codify a morality. Part 3 of the Indian Constitution jettisons an imperial public morality for, and I shall deal with this a little later, a democratic and republican constitutional morality. Therefore, a moral reading of our Constitution is unavoidable. The question is, whose morality must guide us? The answer is simple. It must be the values of the Constitution and of the founders of the Indian Republic that we apply. Let me now come to the question of a substantive view of democracy. I expect that many of you will vote this year, and that for most of you it might be your first general election. Consider for a moment what democracy must mean. No one will dispute that India is a constitutional democracy. There is, of course, the right to vote that is necessary, and the formal requirement of any government being called a democracy is indeed universal adult franchise. But it would be a seriously emaciated idea of democracy to say that we can simply stop there. It is not simply majority rule. That is governance by the will of the people. It is also the protections for the weak, the vulnerable, and the creation of spaces where dissenters are allowed the same freedoms as those in the majority. So when the preamble speaks about democracy, we can take it to have been realized every time we vote, or we could look to the spirit of the Constitution. We could take the constitutionally moral view of a rich and substantive view of democracy. It is precisely this menu of options that the Supreme Court had before it in ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkant Shukla. Justice Khanna's views in dissent prevail today. The reason for the endurance of his view is precisely that he looked to substance over form, to the real heart of the Constitution, and to the purpose of its guarantees, rather than remaining satisfied with a technical and mechanical approach to the Constitution's words. Justice Khanna was truly a constitutional moralist. We must also not forget that Justice Khanna also tipped the scales in Keshavananda Bharati. Justice Khanna was of the view that fundamental rights and the rule of law had life outside of the Constitution's text. The result in his view is that Indians had a right to life and personal liberty, irrespective of whether it appeared in Article 21 of the Constitution, and inroads into that right could not be made except under the authority of law. Constitutional morality was first recorded by an English historian by the name of George Grote in his 19th century work called A History of Greece. It was borrowed and built by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and I say without any fear of contradiction, one of the most learned participants in the Constituent Assembly, who gave so much of his resource and time in the making of India's Constitution. Dr. Ambedkar realized very early the important role that constitutional morality would play in upholding the rights and freedoms granted by the Constitution. It's very interesting to note that in his address to the Constituent Assembly on 4th November 1948, he quoted Grote. In his study of Greece, Athens' democracy, Grote had argued that it had become necessary at that time to create in the multitude or the masses in the Athenian city-state the rare and difficult sentiment which he termed as constitutional morality, with the object of through them to forcing a commitment to the sentiment upon the leading men. This was a sentiment to be harbored by the whole of the nation state. And I quote these words, they're of great importance. The diffusion of constitutional morality, not merely among the majority of any community, but throughout the whole, is the indispensable condition of a government at once free and peaceable, since even any powerful and obstinate majority may render the working of a free institution impracticable without being strong enough to conquer ascendancy for themselves. Apart from Athens, there are only two other places and times where constitutional morality came to be realized according to Grote. The first was the events surrounding the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which led to the passage of the Bill of Rights of 1869 in the British Parliament to set out civil rights and clarify the line of succession to the crown. The second was the birth and flourishing of American constitutionalism in the next century. On 4th November 1948, Dr. Ambedkar quoted Grote and said, "By constitutional morality, Grote meant a paramount reverence for the forms of the Constitution, enforcing obedience to authority, acting under and within these forms, yet combined with the habit of open speech, of action subject only to definite legal control, and unrestrained censure of those very authorities as to all their public acts, combined too with a perfect confidence in the bosom of every citizen, amidst the bitterness of party contests, that the forms of the Constitution will not be less sacred in the eyes of his opponents than in his own." For Ambedkar, constitutional morality held the threads of the Constitution together. And just in the Dworkinian account of the interpretivist judges, the paramount duty of public officials, including judges, was to give reasons in a manner which kept them intelligible and accountable to layman and lawyer alike. I now come to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in three very important judgments, has touched upon constitutional morality as a fundamental basis of discovering the true spaces within the meaning of rights in Part 3 of the Constitution. Pausing here for a moment, I would like my friends to bear in mind that the Constitution has two texts. It has what is called the rights text, and it has what is called the governance text. The rights texts are actually a check on the governance texts. The governance texts are meant to be exercised in the light of the rights texts. That is why we must understand that without the rights, the powers of governance are entirely arbitrary and too full and cannot be given in a democratic state. Therefore, rights are the bulwark of a constitution and indeed the foundation of any civilized society. We must bear this particular praxis in mind and always take into account that when an action of a government is being scrutinized, we have to see first whether it emanates lawfully from the governance text. 2, is it for a purpose truly encapsulated in the governance text? 3, does it infringe the rights text? And 4, if it does infringe, does it do so legally? And 5, if it does infringe even legally, is it proportionate or reasonable? Having said that, in Puttaswamy, which was a part-breaking judgment, the court held the individual is the focal point of the Constitution. And I think this is actually one of the landmark judgments of the Supreme Court, where the court was not only a custodian of constitutional rights, but in fact entered the discourse of constitutional morality in a completely frontal manner. Thus, the entire edifice of the state in Puttaswamy, according to the Supreme Court, lives and works in the service of allowing each of us as individual citizens to live free and meaningful lives. Second, Puttaswamy said, dignity is an indispensable moral and constitutional value. Third, privacy is a natural right, and natural rights flow from theistic morality, which in turn recognizes and affirms the divinity of the human person. The court has accepted this approach in toto. But why did they say so? The court said, these constitutional precepts exist in unity to facilitate a humane and compassionate society. The individual is the focal point of the Constitution because it is the realization of his individual rights that the collective well-being of the community is determined. I come to a second case, which is in the state of NCT versus Union of India, where the concept of constitutional morality was expressly invoked by the court as a guiding light in constitutional interpretation. This was in the context of deliberative democracy. The Chief Justice noted that constitutional morality is that fulcrum which acts as an essential check upon the high functionaries and citizens alike, as experience has shown that unbridled power without any checks and balances would result in a despotic and tyrannical situation which is antithetical to the very idea of democracy. We must not forget that in our preamble we have the words equality, liberty, and fraternity, and these are actually intended to be the triangular values. This leads to what the Vice-Chancellor described correctly as constitutional trust. The constitutional trust is the trust which is reposed in the functionaries under the Constitution. The trust is that they will be guided by constitutional morality, objective pragmatism, and the balance that is required to sustain a proper administration. They actually expect governance for the betterment of society, healthy relationship, and mutual respect, having an open mind for acceptance. Justice Chandrachud, in his concurring opinion, said, one of the essential features of constitutional morality, thus, is the ability and commitment to arrive at decisions on important issues consensually. It requires that despite all differences, we are part of a common deliberative enterprise. In my view, Justice Chandrachud's judgment actually is the first ascendant step in the matter of interpretation of constitutional morality. Justice Chandrachud goes on to say further, a constitution can establish a structure of government, but how these structures work rests upon the fulcrum of constitutional values. But a sense of constitutional morality drawn from the values of the document enables us to hold to account our institutions and those who preside over their destinies. Constitutional interpretation, therefore, must flow from constitutional morality. So, in the primordial perspective of Montesquieu, constitutional morality not only helped maintain the separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial bodies, but also at the sub-levels of governance. In the words of Justice Chandrachud, democracy is not limited to electing governments. In a later judgment, in Krishna Kumar Singh, which dealt with the powers of the executive to promulgate ordinances, Justice Chandrachud said, the court must adopt an interpretation which furthers the basic constitutional premise of legislative control over ordinances. The preservation of this constitutional value is necessary for parliamentary democracy to survive on the sure foundation of the rule of law and collective responsibility of the executive to the legislature. These words of Justice Chandrachud's judgment have special meaning, and I quote, the silences of the Constitution must be imbued with substantive content by infusing them with a meaning which enhances the rule of law. To attribute to the executive as an incident of the power to frame ordinances an unrestricted ability to create binding effects for posterity would set a dangerous precedent in a parliamentary democracy. I come to the next judgment, which is in Na's foundation. As you're aware, the Delhi High Court had held that popular morality could not inform the law, and it held that a constitutional morality, however, did so. The court held that if there is any type of morality that can pass the test of compelling state interest, it must be constitutional morality and not public morality. The Constitution Bench in Navtej Singh Johar has come to its independent conclusions for the purpose of striking down Section 377. Chief Justice Mishra said, the concept of constitutional morality is not limited to the mere observance of the core principles of constitutionalism, as the magnitude and sweep of constitutional morality is not confined to the provisions and literal texts which a constitution contains. Rather, it embraces within itself virtues of a wide magnitude, such as that of ushering a pluralistic and inclusive society, while at the same time adhering to the other principles of constitutionalism. It is further the result of embodying constitutional morality that the values of constitutionalism trickle down and percolate through the apparatus of the state for the betterment of each and every individual citizen of the state. The society as a whole, or even a minuscule part of the society, may aspire and prefer different things for themselves. They are perfectly competent to have such a freedom to be different, like different things, so on and so forth, provided that their different tastes and the liking remain within their legal framework and neither violates any statute nor results in the abridgment of fundamental rights of any other citizen. I must say that one of the great contributions in this judgment has been that society cannot have a homogeneous, uniform, consistent, and standardized lot of people. Justice Mishra says, any attempt to push and shove a homogeneous, uniform, consistent, and standardized philosophy throughout the society would violate the principle of constitutional morality. Devotion and fidelity to constitutional morality must not be equated with the popular sentiment prevalent at a particular point of time. The concept of constitutional morality would serve as an aid for the court to arrive at a just decision. And later he says, the idea of number in this context is meaningless, like zero on the left side of any number. Justice Chandrachud adds, the conception of constitutional morality is different from that of public or societal morality. Under a regime of public morality, the conduct of society is determined by popular perceptions exist in society. The continuance of certain symbols, labels, names, or body shapes determine the notions, sentiments, and mental attitudes of the people towards individuals and things. I want to pause here, and I want to add a few words at this juncture. This sentence needs to be understood in a strictly psychological sense. When we are enjoined by the Constitution to accord mutual respect, we are meant to transcend our first impulses of cognition, because our mental attitude, seeing a symbol, seeing a label, seeing a name, seeing a body shape, seeing a color, may rush us with a certain thought or action. But it is that thought or action which can be completely deleterious to the process of equality. And that is why Justice Chandrachud says in the next sentence, constitutional morality determines the mental attitude towards individuals and issues by the text and the spirit of the Constitution. I personally believe that this is the best definition you will ever get to see of this expression, constitutional morality. Not only is it an adequate definition, but any definition in the field of logic must serve a purpose. The purpose which this definition serves, it makes you think. That is, our mental attitudes are meant to be determined. We have mental attitudes towards individuals when we meet them, when we hear them, when we see them, when we see works of art, when we see expressions. But it is constitutional morality which determines the mental attitude. It requires that the rights of an individual ought not to be prejudiced by popular notions of society. Constitutional morality reflects that the ideal of justice is an overriding factor. And now all of you will remember that justice is also one of the words in the preamble of the Constitution. Constitutional morality reflects that the ideal of justice is an overriding factor in the struggle for existence over any other notion of social acceptance. It builds and protects the foundations of a democracy without which any nation will crack under its fissures. Then, a little more, we come to a slightly more progressive posture in the reasoning. It is a guarantee, that's constitutional morality, which seeks that all inequality is eliminated from the social structure and each individual is assured of the means for the enforcement of the rights guaranteed. Constitutional morality leans towards making Indian democracy vibrant by infusing a spirit of brotherhood amongst a heterogeneous population belonging to different classes, races, religions, cultures, castes, and sections. Constitutional morality cannot, however, be nurtured unless as recognized by the preamble. There exists fraternity, which assures and maintains the dignity of each individual. Having said this, I would say that the best way, before I move to the next part, is to borrow an excerpt from Mr. Palkiwala. The survival of our democracy and the unity and integrity of the nation depend upon the realization that constitutional morality is no less essential than constitutional legality. Dharma, righteousness, sense of public duty or virtue lives in the hearts of public men. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no amendment can save it. I'm reminded of the words of Einstein. The strength of the Constitution lies entirely in the determination of each citizen to defend it. Only if every single citizen feels duty-bound to do his share in this defense are the constitutional rights secure. Thus, a duty is imposed on everyone which no one must evade, notwithstanding risks and dangers for him and his family. I now come to the next point, which is, and that is in the context of what the Vice-Chancellor mentioned. What, therefore, is expected from the government in terms of constitutional morality. I say the following. First, it must have the correct perspective of itself. Charity begins at home. And however powerful you may be, you must have the right perspective of your own authority in government. Unless you know that you are limited by the Constitution and you are a servant of the law and the spirit of the Constitution, the first perspective would not have been gained. After the first perspective comes the people who are to be served, namely the citizens of the country. A government must have a perspective towards the citizens of the country. A government must bear in mind that they have their rights, and in a vast diaspora, there are bound to be a pluralism of values, a pluralism of tastes and temperaments. But governments cannot take sides. Governments have to treat all alike. And if there are any marginalized, vulnerable, disadvantaged, whether factually, situationally, government has to protect them. This perspective of the government towards its citizens is the second major premise of constitutional morality. What is the third premise? The third premise is government is an executive government under the Constitution. It is answerable to Parliament. If it is answerable to Parliament and the legislature, it must consider that the legislature is one of the most vital and important instruments where the actions of the executive can be debated, tested, and in fact criticized, including by the members of the ruling party which actually has foisted the government. I would like all people to note that freedom within Parliament was granted by virtue of Article 105, 1 of the Constitution, deliberately. The purpose of this was that even those who belonged to the political party which had actually formed the government could still participate in the parliamentary process and raise questions which were critical of the functioning of the government. If you look at the parliamentary debates in the early years of this country, you will notice that when the first four prime ministers were there, there are umpteen questions which are asked by members of the party, which actually was the party from where the government was formed, which asked questions. Therefore, the protection of parliamentary freedom to enable persons to ask questions, because accountability of the executive takes place in dual forms in our Constitution. It takes place first to the Parliament, and secondly, it takes place to the judiciary. Then I come to the next. Government must be conscious about the extent of its lawmaking powers, including the powers to tinker with the Constitution. No man is supreme under this Constitution. No individual is indispensable under this Constitution. There is no one who can lay a claim to infallibility under this Constitution. There is no individual or a persona designator who enjoys the stamp of eternity under this Constitution. Much as human ambition may be, but the Constitution actually expects a mature, sober, and a more careful reflection on the part of those who govern. Thus, this is another premise, namely, that the executive government must be conscious of the extent of lawmaking power under the Constitution. I then come to another point, the sixth point, and that is a very important point. The rule of law. An executive government which does not feel that the rule of law is its shining knight in companion will be no government at all. Any government which thinks that the law is meant to be simply muzzled will not actually carry forward either the spirit of the Constitution, nor will it carry forward the faith of the people in the working of the Constitution. The voice of people may be sometimes muffled. The voice of people may sometimes not be heard. We do not know the situational circumstances in which the multitude of our country, and particularly those who are underprivileged and who live in the most deplorable conditions, actually come from. While we in this hall are able to debate in an idyllic way on constitutional morality, in this blistering heat, we must not forget our hundreds of individuals, young children, men and women, who do not know from where their next day's labor shall come. It is an important point. The point being that unless and until there is an excessive consideration for the rights of all, and that is a creed of faith in the rule of law, and a government is wedded to the rule of law, not by compulsion, not by legal advice, but as a part of its innate nature, as a part of its intrinsic character, I'm afraid the spirit of the Constitution will not be subserved. Number 7, the attitude of the government towards the most important component of the state under the Constitution. The custodian of the Constitution, the silences of the Constitution, the balances of the Constitution, to see whether the limitations of power imposed by the Constitution have been adequately addressed by executive government, is the role of the judiciary. An executive government must have the correct attitude towards the judiciary. An executive government is at arm's length from the judiciary. It is completely unexpected of the Constitution that executive and the judiciary work hand in hand. There is no hand in hand as far as the executive and the judiciary under the Constitution is concerned. The meaning of the expression fear or favor, which occurs in the schedule of oaths to the Constitution, bear different meanings for those who actually are members of the legislature, or those who adorn ministerial offices, and those who actually are sworn in as judges of the superior judiciary. The meaning of the expression fear or favor, which is for judges, has a completely different signification. Fearlessness and without any favor implies the highest stands of distance and detachment from the executive at all points of time for an independent judiciary. An independent judiciary is an equally sacred task of the executive. The executive cannot lay its blame for any comments on the judiciary at the feet of the judiciary itself. It has as much a vital stake in public credibility in the workings of the three organs of the state. Thus, if the spirit of the Constitution has to be subserved, public faith in the Constitution must actually be fostered. Public faith in the working of the Constitution can be fostered only when we find that all these premises are actually inviolable articles of creed which are embraced by men in power, whoever they be, whatever political party they may belong to, but they are committed to the welfare of the people, but ultimately the sacred text of the Constitution. We must not forget that our Constitution is a byproduct of immense labor, toil, sacrifice. We must not forget that so many men and matters have actually come to pass before we claimed our tryst with destiny. Our tryst with destiny must not be chimeric. Our tryst with destiny must not be controlled by any form of media simply. Our tryst with destiny must be felt within our own hearts as far as the manner in which we feel the Constitution is living for ourselves. The surroundings outside us must be able to tell us how good is the Constitution working for us. The surroundings within us, our climate within and our climate without, must be able to tell us how good are these premises. Are these not the correct premises? Are these common grounds? Are these not the premises on the basis of which constitutional morality is meant to be established? If the Supreme Court has taken leaping strides in the development of jurisprudence as it has done, and it may have done, and it has done so, not in a very long period, unlike in the United States, unlike in many other jurisdictions, including common law jurisdictions, India must be a proud country that in the year 2019, we have judges of the Supreme Court who have said that even the silences of the Constitution will be imbued with the deepest spaces of constitutional morality. What are spaces? And that is the ninth and the last. A government must also understand that it must give every citizen his space. Every citizen is entitled to breathe in a space. He's entitled to feel in a space. He's entitled to suffer his cognition, his problems, deliberate, imagine, and write and express. He has his own individual universe. It is that universe which is guaranteed under this Constitution. If we do not see each individual as unique as the other, and that is what modern genetics has helped us, and the evolutionary theories of today have only advanced our own beliefs that every one of us has enormous kinetic potential of extraordinary nature, which are actually being unfurled by greater and greater discoveries in the form of genetics and understanding of genetic mutations. But I must add, as a footnote of caution, that although I am not a particularly avowed scientist, but as one who has respect for sciences, that if we allow fear of understanding the Constitution, the fear of allowing the light of the Constitution to invade our recesses of the mind, if the fear of circumstances within and without actually control our being, then I'm afraid we also will suffer a mutation in the progress of time. There is far too much at stake in our actions. Our actions make the Constitution, and our omissions may actually put the Constitution at peril. Therefore, we also as citizens have as much a duty. Our duty is also that premise that we are equally responsible for the Constitution. We are the proud inheritors of the Constitution, and we will ensure, as not simply merely narrow-minded persons who speak about morality in a subjective form, but objective constitutional morality, to insist that executive, legislature, and all the organs of the state work on common assumed premises of, shall I say, the greatest common good. To conclude, I would like to say that the philosophy of religion is also somewhat significant. Our Constitution gives religious rights, but our Constitution also gives rights of conscience which may exclude religious rights. In other words, a person may not be religious but he may still act out of conscience. It is well known that a theist cannot be devoid of conscience. It is also true that agnostics cannot be devoid of conscience, as long as we have a man, and a man with a mind. And that is where we come to one of the most important parts of Western thought, and, shall we say, the theory of ethics and the theory of morality. As long as man has a mind, and as long as man has a situation in front of him, his ethical sentences may not express propositions, but they do project emotional attitudes as thought, as if they are real properties. And this is indeed what is today called as the Blackburn's challenge in modern philosophical discourse overseas. But I'll leave that aside. Suffice it to say that whichever way we look at our position, and we don't have to look at it necessarily through the eye of religious freedom. You, of course, have guaranteed religious freedom. You have denominational freedom that can never be taken away. But more importantly, you have the freedom of conscience. The freedom of conscience is in some sense a part of the freedom of human dignity, and as much as a part of, shall I say, human liberty. I would therefore say that if there was actually, shall we say, an amalgam of Kantian deontology and also consequentialism and contractarianism, and all the three put together, we would still arrive at what I believe these premises which I mentioned, 9 for the state and 1 for us the citizen, the tenor, as a charter of what I believe to be modern social liberalism, which will stand even the test of what, shall I say, which will stand the test, and more importantly, as Derek Parfit has put it brilliantly, it would protect the future self. It would be as good as population ethics, which explains environmental laws, which is meant to protect the environment. Similarly, I think the future will be safe and sound on a correct understanding of constitutional morality. But this must be not only a one-way street. This is indeed an effort of assumption, and it is an effort, more importantly, of introversion. It is this introversion which will enable us to take, shall we say, not only in psychological terms of cognitive analysis, but even in terms of exploration into the deeper recesses of our mind, that are these candles shining brightly, and do we see light within our own selves as clearly and as necessarily as we can. Remember, if you see the light within, the light outside shall be seen. It is the light within which always is important. It is important that in the prayer song, which started with that beautiful line, was again in the context of what I have spoken about, fraternity. And can you believe that I'm a lawyer and I'm speaking from a constitutional standpoint? And that was a composition by one of the most sacred and extraordinary saints of this country without a manner of doubt. And he used the word fraternity. Why did he use the word fraternity? Because the word fraternity is also, as Thomas Aquinas said, something which will bind. Like conscience, it will bind. And anything which binds will provide you what Viktor Frankl said as man's search for meaning. Thank you.